Well, hello, I'm Josh, and I'm back once again with another great film to tell you about. And I have a really fun one for you today that's in the vein of some of the best Hitchcock thrillers. That film I'm talking about is Richard Franklin's 1981 Road Games. Set in Australia, American truck driver Patrick Quid is given the job of driving a truck full of frozen pigs across the continent. But when he suspects another driver on the road to be the serial killer he's been hearing about on the news, he, a hitchhiker nicknamed Hitch, and his pet dingo set off to catch the killer in what soon becomes a game of cat and mouse in this sort of rear window on wheels. So as I said, Road Games was directed by Richard Franklin, who was a big up-and-coming director in Australia. He studied all the great filmmakers of classic Hollywood, but by far his favorite was Alfred Hitchcock. And so by the time he made this film, he was incredibly well versed in all of his work and was practically a Hitchcock scholar. And so he used this film as a chance to finally put everything he had learned from the great director into practice. And when I mentioned that this film feels a lot like Rear Window, it wasn't just in the similarities of the premise. Much like how Hitchcock had each of the tenants in their own little boxes going about their lives while the main characters made comments and observations throughout the story, here we have much the same thing, only with these colorful characters being seen within the confines of different vehicles. And throughout their journey, Quid encounters many of these characters multiple times on the road, and so this stretch of highway really ends up becoming the perfect setting for this reinterpretation. And I also can't disregard the influence that Steven Spielberg's Duel likely had on this as well. Despite the differences in story, with this being a sort of perspective reversal as we're actually inside the truck this time, I think it's hard for any film, especially at this point with this much real driving in it, to not at least take some inspiration from how it was shot, particularly on such a low budget. And much like Duel was for Spielberg, Road Games was certainly an excellent Hollywood calling card for Richard Franklin, who was hired on to direct Psycho 2 fairly soon afterwards, a seemingly impossible sequel to make given the prestige of the original and the demands of movie audiences of the 80s with the rise of slasher films. But Franklin towed the line quite well and made a very fine sequel, though its connection to such a classic meant that critics at the time were of course not likely to give much praise to such a film at all. But that being said, I still think Road Games is a much stronger film, as it really feels like a loving tribute to the films of Alfred Hitchcock while being adapted to the outback of Australia, so it still feels very much like its own thing, and ultimately like nothing we have seen before. So Franklin was able to make a film much closer to how we thought Hitchcock would have done, relying on editing and implication while showing little to no blood. And it all just works, with a plot that makes you lean in more and more the further it goes along. And another aspect of this, which is really true of most great thrillers, but especially the Hitchcock ones, is that the film is incredibly visual. I mentioned earlier that it has these very precise shot compositions which were clearly storyboarded, and by doing this, Franklin was able to construct the film in such a way where the visuals really tell the story, so once the soundtrack is added, it just becomes even more immersive. And another thing I appreciate that we don't always see in movies is that there is also a lot of work done to make each character distinct and memorable. That kind of attention to detail is important for really any film, as it just makes the story more engaging for the audience, but it is essential for a film like this, where you are supposed to recognize people that you may not have seen for close to half an hour. For instance, the killer is rarely ever shown in full view, and is almost always obscured in some way, which makes him feel way more sinister as we are left to imagine how he looks for most of the film. But this also means that we have very little to remember him by, so as sort of a calling card to help us recognize him, he wears these odd-looking knitted gloves, which are not only hard to forget, but are also colored white so they easily draw your attention to them even in darker lighting. And the cast of this film is great. Stacy Keach is perfect as Patrick Quid, the poetry-citing main character who insists he simply drives trucks but is not a truck driver. And you can see him in other great films like John Huston's Fat City and William Peter Blatty's The Ninth Configuration, But after this film, Keach didn't really get many more leading roles. That being said, he is still one of the most consistently working actors to date, and might be best known for portraying Mickey Spillane's hard-boiled detective Mike Hammer. Jamie Lee Curtis is also great in this as the American hitchhiker nicknamed Hitch, which was of course also Alfred Hitchcock's nickname. And her being the daughter of Psycho star Janet Leigh in real life just solidifies this Hitchcock connection even more, but she had actually been making a name for herself in her own right, such as in the horror classic Halloween, directed by none other than Richard Franklin's own USC classmate John Carpenter. And the killer was played by the late stunt coordinator Grant Page. Now you might not recognize his name, but he was really one of the best stuntmen in Australia, and he worked on several of the Mad Max films with George Miller, including the most recent one, Furiosa: A Mad Max Saga, prior to passing away this year at the age of 85. And you can also see Robert Thompson, who played the title character in director Richard Franklin's previous film, Patrick, in a cameo role here as the sneezing rider that Quid passes by. And though Road Games is a relatively little known film today, largely due to its shaky release, which Richard Franklin believed was due to its marketing as a slasher film despite being a much more traditional thriller, the film has since found its audience on home video, and is now considered to be a very highly acclaimed film, and is even said to be a favorite of director Quentin Tarantino.
I'm a huge fan of Richard Franklin, and I think that's him at his Hitchcockian best. I think that's a truly magnificent thriller.
So if you like to watch Road Games, it is available to rent or buy from all the usual places online, and as of now it's apparently available to stream on Peacock, Shudder, and Tubi as well. But if you want to get the film physically, it's available on a very nice Blu-ray from Shout Factory's horror line called Scream Factory. It's got lots of bonus features, including some archival ones with Richard Franklin, who sadly passed away back in 2007. So it's really nice to see him so much on this disc. And it's also got some more recent interviews with people like Stacy Keach as well, so it's really a well-rounded collection and definitely came in handy when I was trying to research this film. But now for my comment question, I'm wondering, what is your favorite Hitchcock film that wasn't actually directed by Hitchcock? That's to say, a film that is clearly a tribute to the master of suspense and tries to borrow and further on the techniques and tricks he was doing. I mean, Richard Franklin's films were often very much in this vein, but you could also just as easily point to Brian De Palma's work. And I mean, even in the 60s, you had films like Stanley Donen's Charade and J. Lee Thompson's Cape Fear, which were pretty clearly Hitchcock-inspired. So feel free to get creative with this one and put your favorites in the comments section down below and start discussing. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you want to see some more of these. Remember to keep watching movies, and I will see you again soon.